Thank you so much for being here tonight, and welcome to Live from the Library. I'm Lori Tinfo, and I'm a member of the Board of Directors for the Library Foundation, and we're so pleased to see all of you here tonight. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to thank our program sponsors, the East Bay Times, the Friends of the Walnut Creek Library, and Minuteman Press Lafayette. We really appreciate their ongoing support. Yeah, absolutely. So tonight, our speaker is Melissa Leventon, who I've known for many years, many more than I realized as I started counting back. I met Melissa through my husband, Greg. She and Greg both sing, and in the late 90s, they formed an a cappella group. That connection then evolved into me learning about Melissa's professional side and how art, fashion, food, history, and culture are all interwoven. Melissa has a very impressive resume, and you're going to hear more about that tonight. She has experience as a museum consultant, an appraiser, a teacher, specializing in European and American fashion and textiles. She's organized exhibitions on topics ranging from French couture to wearable art to the Dead Sea Scrolls. As an appraiser and a consultant, Melissa has worked with many clients, including the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, the Denver Art Museum, and the Textile Museum, among many more. Her publications include several books and catalog essays, and she's appeared as an on-screen expert for the Craft in America series and in Riveted, an episode, I believe, or a theme, for the American Experience. She is formerly curator in charge of textiles at the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco, and she now serves as senior adjunct professor in the Fashion, Design, and History of Art and Visual Culture Department at California College of the Arts in San Francisco. She also chairs the Board of Trustees of the San Jose Museum of Quilts and Textiles. So tonight, Melissa is here to talk about Artwear, fashion and anti-fashion, and there's been a lot of buzz about what is anti-fashion, so you're going to hear all about, and I'm sure it's going to be really fascinating. As a reminder, if you enjoy tonight's program, please consider making a donation to the foundation to support our programs like this. You can visit our website, which I won't read it to you, but you can just Google Walnut Creek Library Foundation, and it will pop up, so you can use that to donate. Or we have a handy-dandy tip jar in the back, so feel free to make a tip if you get some refreshments. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Melissa Leventon.
Thank you, Lori. What a wonderful introduction. I sound amazing on paper. Remind me to increase your salary. I'm adding 0 to the end of it. So you've heard a little bit about me, and the talk that I'm going to give you tonight is based on research that I did in the 1990s and early 2000s, longer ago than I care to remember, that culminated in an exhibition at the Legion of Honor in San Francisco and a catalog called Artwear, Fashion and Anti-Fashion. And I usually do start this lecture with a definition. And the definition I usually start with is a definition of artwear. But several of the people that I was chatting with before the lecture said, "What's anti-fashion?" So I thought I'd actually start with that. Fashion essentially is, I think about it as a big umbrella. It is what do we feel, not only what is the fashion industry churning out season after season and year after year, but what are the bigger parameters about what that says about what it's okay for any of us to wear at any given time. So that's fashion, if you like. The conventions of dress of a particular time and a particular place and a particular group of people. Anti-fashion are people, or anti-fashion can be a variety of movements, usually created by people who look around at fashion and say, that's not me. That's not what I want. I want to make a completely separate statement, and I'm going to get far enough away, one way or another, from the sort of centrifuge of fashion so that people notice that I look different. Anti-fashion, you can oftentimes think of it as street style. It's one of those things, one of the sort of impulses that powers street style when, you know, every mass market store and Shein and all of the fast fashion merchants are churning out the latest knockoffs of whatever has walked down the higher fashion runways. The people who are practicing street style, the really cool dressers, they're off doing something else. And a season or two or three later, fashion will look over and go, I like that. I think I'll have some of that. And they kind of move in and begin to adopt their own version of it, which then circulates through the mass market. In the meantime, all the cool kids are off doing something else. So they're another couple of steps in front. So what anti-fashion is really is the fuel that is pushing the fashion system along. That's in a lot of ways how the system actually operates. But when you're young and I'm not going to tell you how old I am, but clearly I've been knocking around this for a while. And so when you've been looking at the system and studying the system for a while and not leaning on your keyboard, you can begin to understand how the process works. But when you're young and just starting out, you don't realize that you can't necessarily maintain that anti-fashion stance for long. And so it's this constant process of, almost like keep away. Anti-fashion runs in front, fashion is in hot pursuit, and sometimes they get closer together, and sometimes they are further apart. And ultimately, fashion is, as I said, the umbrella within which we all dress. So it's very uncomfortable to get too far away from that. And so I hope that is a reasonable definition for you of what anti-fashion is. So now let's talk about artwear. It goes by a whole bunch of different names. You can call it artwear, you can call it wearable art, you can call it art to wear, or art couture, or fashion art, or artisan fashion, and people have called it any and all of those things at various different points in time, and it actually can mean quite a number of things. And the type that I'll be spending most of my time on this evening is the type that arose in the 1960s and 1970s, and it denotes a garment made by an artist, usually somebody who's got formal training in fine art of some kind, and it's made from handmade textiles. So something like this. The base of this is actually a commercial textile. It's wool jersey, wool knit, but all of the snakes on the kimono are hand crocheted. And then they're appliqued on, and it's been padded and lined and hand quilted. So there's a lot of handwork and a lot of artist-made textiles in this garment. This is a good example of the artwear of the mid-1970s. And these garments were intended to be understood as art, not as fashion. Not as designer high fashion, not as the kind of mass-produced clothes that most of us wear most of the time. So this was, at this period, an anti-fashion movement. They didn't want to be fashion designers. They wanted to be artists, and they wanted to have their textiles and their clothing accepted by the fine art establishment as art. And not necessarily particularly by the fashion establishment as fashion. They wanted to be something else. So originally, they were all one of a kind and laboriously handmade. This is all made from folded satin ribbon. Most of them utilized non-Western or ethnic garment forms, especially the kimono or similar T-shaped garments, instead of the fashionable tailored shape of whatever the moment happened to be. And a lot of them were envisioned as wall hangings, either instead of or in addition to garments to be worn. So you'd hang it on the wall as easily as you might hang it from your shoulders. But over time, wearable art as a concept and also as a marketing term, if you like, has extended to embrace a number of other things. One of them is commercial fashion that incorporates images of art that originally appeared in other media. And this sweater, which was produced in 1986 and advertised in Harper's Bazaar, the image was licensed by Erte, by the artist, to a sweater manufacturer to make this sweater. So the artist participated, but this was originally a work on paper. It had nothing to do with clothing originally. Erte just saw an opportunity, maybe to make a little money, and get this 35 or 36 or 45 or 46-year-old piece out in the public again. It also encompassed fashion that is an active collaboration between a fashion designer and an artist. Issey Miyake did a number of these. This is the first one that he did in 1986. It also encompasses performance art. These are pieces by Kaizek Wang, a San Francisco artist that I'll talk about a bit more a little bit later on, that were commissioned by Salvador Dali for the opening of Dali's museum in Figueres, Spain. And the 7 rays were never finished because Dali never paid the bill. So wearable art is by no means solely an American phenomenon, but it's here, really, that it originated and also that it developed most thoroughly in this late 20th century period. And most of what I've shown you so far is artware from the 1960s and 1970s, but it has very distinguished ancestors in the arts and crafts movement and the anti-fashion dress reformers of the middle and late 19th century. Whoops, I forgot to show you this. This is also conceptual. You can't wear these. This is by Gaza Bowen. It's called The Little Woman's Night Out. And if you look closely at the shoes, which are made just like a regular pair of shoes on a shoemaker's last, they're made of household cleaning products and scrub brushes. The ornaments at the throat are sink drains. So you could put them on your foot, but they will not hold your weight if you stand up in them. So they are officially unwearable, wearable art. So here we are in the 19th century. And dress reforms started with a group of women that included Amelia Bloomer, who became the most famous of this particular group of women, although the Bloomer costume that she is wearing, which was named for her, is not something that, in fact, she designed or invented herself. Most dress reformers were also very interested in women's suffrage. So this is first wave feminism. Women who were campaigning for the right to vote, the right to own their own property, the right to divorce, the right to maintain custody of their children. If they divorced, the right to access to higher education. Those kinds of rights were the first wave of feminists. And a lot of dress reformers were involved in this, and they saw that the liberation of women from the fashions of the time. Amelia Bloomer's outfit actually looks pretty comfy. It's described for you on the screen, so I'm not going to read that to you, but this is the sort of thing that women were actually wearing. This is from 25 years later, but this is a very fashionable French evening dress by an haute couture house on the left from 1884. And on the right are some of the underpinnings that the wearer of that dress might have been wearing underneath. So she's got on a chemise, which is knee length. She's got on a pair of drawers, which you can see. She's got on a corset. She's got on what's called a lobster tail bustle. And only then do you put your dress on. So imagine what it would feel like walking around in something like this, and all of the constriction that came with the corsetry. And I think you can understand that a lot of women of this era were really happy to escape, or with the idea of escaping these and wearing something a little more rational, or aesthetic, or artistic dress, maybe something that looked like this. This is a type of dress known as a tea gown. It's one of the most formal of a series of at-home dresses that working women wore, because if you were a working woman, you weren't bothering with all of that corsetry and all of those bustles, because you had to actually go out and do hard manual labor. Or you might be at home doing the housework, which was hard manual labor without a whole lot of mod cons. So you might wear a house dress. A tea gown was a very formal version of a house dress worn by middle-class and upper-class women for a couple of hours late in the afternoon when they were at home, and they could take their corsets off or loosen their corsets and kind of breathe deeply and relax a little bit. They were often very pretty. They incorporated various historical elements. That pleated full back that you see is from the 18th century. The high waist with the crossed ribbons in front is a little hint of the early 19th century, the Empire era. The embroidery is Japanese influenced. This was a period of tremendous interest in Asian aesthetics, particularly Japanese aesthetics, a period of Japanism. And so these are the kinds of things that were circulating among fashionable women that would let them get out of that really constricting clothing for a while. A lot of dress reformers were also involved with the anti-industrial arts and crafts, aesthetic, and Art Nouveau movements. These are all movements that basically looked around at the success of the Industrial Revolution. There are a lot of parallels between that and what's been going on more recently with tech in our world, where people are looking around and going, wow, we thought this was really fabulous, and now we're discovering that maybe not so much, because we're beginning to realize everything that we've lost as a result of the mechanization of everything in the 19th century. And one of the things that was being lost was the figure of the craftsman, the artisan, and all of those hand skills that craftspeople practiced. And many of the artists involved in these movements wanted to find a way to preserve them. And so the women who were circulating around this often wore aesthetic dress or artistic dress or reform dress. And that looked rather less fashionable than the tea gown I just showed you. William Morris was the founder of the arts and crafts movement, and this is his wife on the left, Jane Morris, wearing her version of reform dress. This is a dress with a very full skirt that could take a crinoline, a hooped petticoat, in other words, but she's not wearing one. She's also not wearing a corset, and she's got her arms kind of at her waist, which is sort of keeping her dress in place so that she doesn't look too outside what would be considered acceptable for a respectable woman. Now, she's in a private garden being photographed by Dante Gabriel Rossetti, so she wasn't out on the street necessarily wearing this, but there are reports from this era saying that she and her daughters dressed very strangely and looked kind of witch-like. So to people who were following fashion, this looked awfully strange. Mae Morris, her younger daughter on the right, who was an accomplished artist and embroiderer in her own right, is wearing a late 19th century version of aesthetic dress, which is again based on a house dress. And it's very comfortable, it's very loose. You can see that this is something that she could actually work in. You can move in this, but it doesn't bear a whole lot of resemblance other than the bit of the puff in the sleeves. It doesn't bear a whole lot of resemblance to what was in fashion in 1898. So she's about as far out from the center of fashion as most women were willing to get at this particular time. So the arts and crafts movement and the movements that followed it were rooted in architecture and the decorative arts. They didn't make clothes, most of them. It's certainly not in the UK in the 19th century, but they promoted the idea of better living through the creation of an artistically unified environment. Clothing came a little bit later. But if you move over to Vienna, you see people like this. So this is Emilie Flügge, who was a Viennese dress designer who, with her sisters, ran an extremely successful high fashion design business, design and manufacture business, making one-of-a-kind garments for individual clients who were artistically inclined. They did really, really well for 30 years. They got shut down by the takeover of Austria by the Nazis, as happened to many people, as you'll hear in a little bit. But Emilie Flügge, in addition to being a very accomplished dress designer and businesswoman in her own right, was also the longtime companion of Gustav Klimt. And so it's thought that the two of these collaborated on the dresses that she is wearing, and possibly the jewelry that she is wearing in the slide on the left. They didn't leave much in the way of drawings or notes, so nobody really knows exactly who did what. But they were certainly keeping company with each other and trading aesthetic ideas back and forth. And Klimt, of course, was also a contributor to a much larger Morris-inspired workshop called the Wiener Werkstätte, which translates into the Vienna Workshop. And the Wiener Werkstätte did make both textiles and clothing eventually. And while the textiles followed arts and crafts style, the clothing, as you can see, particularly in its later years, tended to follow prevailing fashion. So the dress that you see on the left is not particularly out of style for 1911, which is the first year that the dress department at the Wiener Werkstätte operated, and the dress designers were encouraged to use the company's textiles. So it's a Wiener Werkstätte textile in the bodice, very arts and crafts. The textile in the dress on the right, also quite arts and crafts, but the dress is clearly very much in circa 1922 high style. And interestingly enough, in the workshop's later years, guess what the primary generator of income was? It was the fashion department. That's what people wanted to buy. So moving countries, here we are in Venice, in Italy, and we get to Mariano Fortuny. Fortuny was a follower of arts and crafts and aesthetic movements. He was a painter by training. He was also a theatrical designer, an inventor, a photographer. He was really a Renaissance man. But his real contribution, his lasting contribution, was as a creator of garments like the ones you see on the screen. The Delphos dresses, which are based on the ancient sculpture of the charioteer at Delphi and other ancient Greek and Roman models. So it's classical dress. It's pleated the way a lot of those dresses are shown to be in things like the vase paintings. And he created a series of wraps and coats and scarves to be worn over these dresses, because when the dresses were first designed circa 1907 and 1908, this would have been really risque. Talk about anti-fashion. Nobody was wearing clothes like this. Fashion caught up with these in the 19-teens and 20s. And they've rarely been out of style since then, although they were out of production for about 50 years. The company started producing them again. I don't know how expensive they are, but my guess is very. In the vein of, if you have to ask, you can't afford it. But you can buy these vintage for mere money. Several sold recently for 5 figures. So they are not inexpensive. But to get back to Fortuny, all of his coats and a lot of his wraps were T-shaped. They were based on non-Western models, things like the burnous, things like the kimono, things like the jalaba. He designed his own patterns. They were hand screen printed. They're very luxurious, and they're made from silk velvet. So they are very, very, very wonderful to wear. So he started as anti-fashion. He became fashion. And in addition to his headquarters in Venice, he had outposts in Paris and New York. And American women in particular loved these clothes. A lot of his clients were American. Moving to Paris, you have Sonia Delaunay. Those of you who are familiar with the art of the interwar period probably know her best as a Cubist painter, for which she was renowned, but she was also an extremely successful textile designer. She designed flat textiles, she designed furnishings like carpet, she designed a lot of scarves, and in the 1920s and early 1930s, she also had a really successful fashion design business. She was married to another Cubist painter, Robert Delaunay, and guess where the money to run the household came from? It came from Sonia Delaunay's fashion business. She did not conceive that there was any qualitative difference between her fashion designs and her painting. And if you look at the design sketches in the left-hand slide, I think you can see how closely they relate to the actual sportswear that she was producing on the right. And so she was very successful. And she is one of the first people truly, I think, to integrate art and fashion in a seamless kind of way. But when fashion changed to the really bias-cut, body-hugging styles of the 30s, those aren't so Cubist. And so she shut down her dress business and went back to designing textiles only as well as painting. So this is all by way of giving you guys some historical context for what was created in the 1960s. And so here we are back to, in fact, the early 1970s. And during the 1930s and 40s, a lot of the artists and craftspeople who had been working for the arts and crafts, for the Wiener Werkstätte, for the Bauhaus, for all of those, for the Werkbund, all of those arts and crafts influenced and modern organizations. Many of them were Jewish, and the Nazis considered a lot of that work to be degenerate, and a lot of them basically got pushed out, and many of them came to the United States. And so you had this whole wave of teachers coming and populating a lot of the art colleges and art programs in the United States. They were making their own work, but they were also teaching the next generation of artists. And so the result was, in this country, we had a really strong post-World War II craft revival that once again looked around at even more mechanization and industrialization and said, we don't like this. We want to do something different. We want to elevate the crafts to the status of fine art. We want to break in. We want to break down these walls that fine art has surrounded itself with. And so also second wave feminism had started gathering steam in the 1950s and really kind of burst into full flower in the 60s and 70s. And like their 19th century predecessors, many of its adherents believed that fashion was a trap that women had to escape in order to reach equality with men. Fashion has long been associated with women in Western culture. It's considered less than, it's considered frivolous, it's considered not important, never mind that it's often the number 1 or number 2 economic generator in any country that has a fashion or textile industry, but the art world has always looked down on it. And so for a generation of artists interested in handmaking, interested in crafts, and interested in having what the traditional feminine crafts, the textiles and the fashion, taken seriously as art. That was the goal for this second wave of feminist-influenced artists who discovered textiles either in the course of their training or shortly thereafter. So it was the perfect environment for the development of another anti-fashion movement. And artwear was the result. It shares a lot of the major characteristics of its predecessors, including the value that's attached to textiles that are made by hand, lots of experimentation to see just how far you can push a medium, trying to distance yourself from fashion, all of those things. But that said, mainstream fashion was actually channeling a lot of these things at exactly the same time. You can't escape that big tent. And so I put this slide up to show you we've got two garments that have a lot in common on the screen. The one on the right was considered fashion. It's by Zandra Rhodes, trained in textile design at the Royal College of Art, working as a small producer inside the standard fashion industry in London. On the left, we have a tunic made from Indian and European collaged textiles, found objects, and two panels from vintage molas that have been turned into sleeves by an artist named Yvonne Porcella, who was self-taught. She was trained as a nurse, but she discovered fashion when she was trying to figure out how to make clothes for herself and just kind of blossomed. And at this particular point in time, these are the kinds of clothes Yvonne was making. So Zandra Rhodes was making things in limited production. This is small run, but still, this is production. You could go into a store and buy it. Whereas Yvonne was making clothes as one of a kind for herself or for her friends at this particular point in time. So this is a tunic, it's now in the Fine Arts Museum's collection, that she made for a friend of hers, and when her friend passed away, the tunic came back to Yvonne and she donated it to the museum during my time there. And so it kind of signifies a lot of what was going on in art to wear. It is handmade by somebody who knew the maker and the wearer knew each other. And you can do it in a variety of ways. In this case, it uses upcycled and new textiles that have been collaged together, all by hand. Interestingly enough, both Zandra Rhodes and Yvonne and many of the other artists were actually looking at the same source for a lot of their garments forms. This is a page from Max Tilke's Costume Patterns and Designs. And Tilke was one of the Bibles. There were several that a lot of the people making artwear in the 70s and 80s were looking at, because it gave you a look at a whole variety of non-Western garments that you could press into service for whatever it was you wanted to make. And so the non-Western garment form was key, because that was one of the ways that these artists expressed their anti-fashion stance. And so the Porcella tunic, and also this outfit, modeled here by Janis Joplin, it was hers, express a lot of the tenets of early artwear as it grew out of hippie street style and found this anti-industrial, anti-fashion identity. In this case, this was made for Janis from a 19th century tablecloth that was probably picked up, at Goodwill on Haight Street by her roommate, Linda Gravenites, who would only make for you if she knew you and if she liked you. If she knew you and didn't like you, you were out of luck. So the idea behind handmade was that, that it gave the garment soul and integrity and celebrated the deep social connections between artist and wearer, that something that you walk into a store and just buy off the rack just does not have. And a lot of this work was not done by professionals. This is a wonderful shirt that was made over time by the maker, Alexandra Jacopetti, now Alexandra Hart, who was a weaver. At the time, she was married to the Roland of Roland shirt. And it was a standard denim work shirt, and she just embroidered this over time. She's the one who put together a book called Native Funk and Flash in 1974 that I'll get back to a little bit later, that was kind of showed the world a lot of what was going on in California with all of these handmade clothes that the counterculture was wearing. Or you could just have your wife or your mother or your sister or yourself or your brother or whoever had a needle and thread and some extra clothes, sew some patches on your jeans. And that's what Alan Copeland, in the photograph on the right, is wearing. His wife patched those jeans. And he explained to me, they were in a shadow box hanging on his wall when I went to see them in the 90s. And he explained that he was a photographer and he was photographing a lot of the demonstrations at Cal in the 1960s, and he wanted to blend in with the students, so he asked his wife to make these for him. So he was wearing the uniform of people 10 years younger than he was. So this morphed eventually from the sort of folk art of people just picking up a needle and thread and collaging or appliquing or embroidering to people who had formal fine art training going, wow, I really like textiles. Let me see what I can do. So, and you get things like this. These are by Kaylee Manuel, who was a South Bay artist. And she got her start because she took a field trip when she was at the San Francisco Art Institute and was told that 95% of the museum's collection would be in the basement in storage at any one time. And she said, I don't want my paintings to be in the basement for the rest of their lives. I want people to see them. I know, I'll paint clothes. And so that was the genesis of an entire career making artwear. And the idea of making clothes as art is especially attractive to women for the same reasons that I've mentioned. And also at the same time, there were fine artists who weren't working in wearable clothing, who were using clothing conceptually in paintings or other artworks. This is a Miriam Shapiro example, one of her Femage. And here is Joseph Boy's felt suit, one of the early multiples, and also Mimi Smith's steel wool peignoir, which is an embellishment of an existing peignoir from the 1930s. So, and these were intended to hang on the wall. You can tell by the mount, which is a hanger. And so this, I think, kind of gave a lot of people permission to go ahead and experiment with garments that actually could be worn. And so this form of artwear developed simultaneously on the East Coast and the West Coast at this period. And a lot of the work coming out of New York was crocheted and very sculptural. And a number of the crocheters came out of Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, although many of them are now here, because the West Coast has pull. The Museum of Contemporary Craft, now known as the Museum of Arts and Design, took a very early interest and began to do exhibitions of this material. And in 1973, New York acquired a major gallery devoted to artwear, Julie Artisan's Gallery, and that's Julie Dale, the proprietor, in the window. On the West Coast, a lot of artists were concentrating on painted and dyed and collaged and woven pieces. It makes sense. It's a lot colder on the East Coast, so you've got a place to wear one of those big chunky knits or crocheted pieces. Out here, the weather's a little nicer, the climate's a little warmer, so maybe you don't want anything quite so heavy. So you'll get dyed and collaged and painted. And most sold or traded locally, and quite a number also made clothes for performance. Most of them had fine art backgrounds. Kaizek Wang, whom I mentioned earlier, was one of the very few people making artwear at this period who actually had formal fashion design training and industry experience. He spent some time in New York. He started a couple of ready-to-wear lines. It's Kaizek modeling that outfit on the right. Although if you didn't know him or know what he looked like, you would have a hard time telling. In fact, I showed his own niece this picture at one point, and I had to point out that it was her uncle wearing that outfit. And Kaizek was very interested in unisex garments, as people are now. It was a recurring theme in his work. And so it makes a lot of sense that he posed for a photographer from Harper's Bazaar, and this photograph ran in Bazaar at the time. Kaizek was also involved in another major American gallery devoted to artwear, and that was Obiko, which was founded in San Francisco by Sandra Sakata in 1993, and the photograph you're looking at is a window that Kaisik had done. He used to do the windows of Obiko every couple of days, so the window would be changing constantly. And it's really impossible to estimate how exciting a place the Bay Area was for fiber art of all kinds, including wearable art, in the 1970s. There were a lot of academic and studio training programs in fiber. CCAC had Trude Germonpré, who was Bauhaus trained. UC Berkeley had Ed Rosbach. UC Davis had Catherine Westphal. All of them were very successful professional fiber artists. There were also a number of independent organizations that played a crucial role in developing the contemporary community, like the Yarn Depot Pacific School of Textile Arts and Fiberworks Center for Textile Arts in Berkeley, which opened in 1973, same year as Obiko, and it offered classes in a wide variety of textile techniques and a gallery, so artists who were taking classes could also show. And it hosted a lot of exhibitions of artwear during its 15-year life. And Fiberworks was also responsible for a real watershed event in the history of artwear, and that is a class in shibori dyeing techniques, taught by artist Yoshiko Wada in 1975. Tie-dye, the kind of tie-dye you think of as hippie tie-dye that's all over my neighborhood in Haight Street, that is a very simple form of shibori. Shibori basically is a Japanese term that describes a resist dye technique. Resist means when you dip something in a dye bath and you've applied something to it that makes part of it not take the dye. It resists the dye. That's what that means. And so shibori fabric resists dye by manipulation. So it's stitched or pleated or twisted or crumpled or tied. So that was the technique that Yoshiko was teaching, and it has become the technique most indelibly associated with artwear. This is a piece by Bay Area artist Annalisa Hedstrom, and Annalisa was in that first class that Yoshiko taught in 1975. Annalisa started out life as a ceramist, and she learned how to do shibori and never looked back. And she is now one of the premier dyers in the world. And this is a piece that she donated to the Fine Arts Museums. It's also in the collection. So by the mid-70s, artwear had everything it needed to allow it to gain acceptance in the art world. It had academic and non-academic sources of training, it had attention from museums, it had a growing clientele, and it had some major galleries. Design-wise, it leaned more and more into ethnic garment forms, particularly the kimono, and I just show you 4 from the 80s and 90s on the screen. Oh, actually, Nikki, I do have one of your pieces. Good. So these represent, the kimono in particular, to these Western artists represented tradition, established custom, and to Westerners really steeped in the Western fashion system, it offered a distinctive and what seemed on the surface to be an unchanging form coupled with beautiful color and pattern. The Japanese greatly esteem the crafts. So the art-craft divide that exists in the West doesn't exist in Japan, which is, I think, another reason the kimono was so attractive to many artists. And so you could also, these are really canvas-like. Look in particular at the Tim Harding piece on the upper right and the Risa Nagin piece on the lower left. You can imagine there are 3 canvases. It's like a triptych. So to anybody trained as a painter, it would have seemed really familiar. They're easy to make, which is perfect for artists who didn't have training in fashion design and pattern drafting. And you didn't have to cut into your laboriously handmade textile, which you had spent hours and hours and hundreds of hours on to create a garment. You could just sew it up the selvages. So for a lot of reasons, this was very attractive to an awful lot of people. So by the time you get to the pieces that you see on the screen, this movement had reached maturity, and it had begun to inch a little closer to fashion. The chunkiness and the overtly handmade qualities that really characterized the work in the 70s gave way in the 80s to sleeker, more graphic, more sophisticated styles that I think characterizes all of the examples on the screen. And I've talked a lot about all of the historical and the external inspirations, but I think also very important to this generation of artists are the intrinsic inspirations, which for a lot of them is content, what is the saying, is technique, and also is process. And that again is part of the craft. You get really involved in the process. Tim Harding, the artist who did the coat on the right, once told me that in trying to, and he uses quite a laborious reverse applique technique, which I'm not going to take the time to explain to you now, but he told me once that he took several layers of textiles out into his backyard. He lives in the Midwest, took his rifle and he shot them to see what would happen. Marion Clayton, I think I may have a piece of hers in the slide deck coming up, once tried patterning textiles in her sandwich toaster, her panini press. So people would do all sorts of crazy things just to see what would happen. And so getting involved in process that way is something that I think fed a lot of people and kept them going in this process. And so it offers you the satisfaction of making by hand. And obviously you have people using very traditional techniques. You've got a number of weavers. I just show you 4 examples drawn almost at random on the screen. A lot of people chose to paint or dye. There's one of Marion's dresses on the upper left. Others chose to go into felting. And then you have people who like to knit. And you can knit with all sorts of things, including copper wire on the upper right, Arlene Fish, who is renowned as a jeweler who pioneered crocheted wire jewelry and body pieces. And also Susie Freeman, who made a piece about birth control for the Wellcome Institute in London. And this is basically made out of nylon monofilament fishing line and birth control pills. And she has machine knitted it, but it's really a gorgeous looking evening dress as well. And if I hadn't told you that all of those spots, those silvery spots, were birth control pills, you wouldn't know, would you? So it can work on multiple levels, and that's part of the joy of sneaking the content in to work that is otherwise very process-oriented. And you also have people who are combining new tools with old techniques. So you might be using digital printers or polyester jersey or airbrush using traditional quilting and applique techniques. Catherine Westphal was using a color Xerox and then sewing all of the little bits of paper that she was Xeroxing together. So it's not that artwear is only doing things that are traditional. People are always investigating new tools, but they're usually combining their new tools with their old techniques and coming up with something new. And of course, you also have things that feature recycling and upcycling, which is very much a part of what is going on in fashion right now. And of course, many of these pieces have content which is as varied as the makers themselves. So the movement that started in the 60s and flowered in the 70s and 80s started to run out of steam in the early 90s. It was a victim of a bunch of things: changing tastes in art and fashion. There was a recession in 1992. I don't know if any of you remember, but there was. And a lot of artists were getting burned out. They'd said all they had to say and they were ready to move on. Some people did hang on, and starting in the mid-90s, there was also renewed interest in the field and some new people started to come in. And I think this is partly the result of the explosion of contemporary art that references fashion in some way, like this piece from Jana Sturbach. But this was outside the artwear community. This is essentially a piece intended to be in a gallery or in a performance, not intended to be worn by somebody walking down the street. It might attract a little bit of attention. And the 1970s revival that started in fashion in the late 1990s and is still with us 25 years later, also prompted new interest by the fashion establishment in some early artwear. And I heard a lot of complaints at the time from artists who felt that the big mass market companies were ripping them off, which fashion does all the time. But it got up to the highest echelons of the fashion system. And I'm running long, so I'm going to make this quick. But Kaizek Wang designed the collaged piece that you see on the left. It was in Native Funk and Flash. Nicolas Gesquier from Balenciaga saw it and said, ooh, I'll copy that, and I'll send it down the runway as the centerpiece of my spring 2002 show. But he got caught. Because somebody else had a copy of Native Funk and Flash, put two and two together and called the press. And this ran in the New York Times under the heading, "Is copying part of the fashion process?" So if anybody has questions about this after, I can go into more depth in the story. So in the 20 years since then, the distance between artwear and fashion, or the dance between them really, as well as the interest in non-wearable garments as art, has continued. And in the interest of time, I'm just going to show you a few more slides. These are two officially non-wearable pieces, Cat Chow, not for sale, made of 1,000 donated dollar bills shredded, that she sort of looped together and glued. She has worn it, but it won't really stand up to wear. The Beverly Rayner accretion piece, which takes basically photographs and scraps of paper, things that people save, and things that we're losing as we become more and more digital, and has appliqued them onto a coat, and that train stretches out like 10 feet. Behind. So again, this is not something, I couldn't fit it all into this slide, but it's not something that you are easily going to wear. So the conceptual aspect of artwear is still very much alive. And one of the more, but also on the wearable side, there's some new artists who've come along who are doing some really interesting things. And one of the most interesting I've run across recently is a woman named Taiba Akweti. She goes by Taiba. And you see 4 pieces from her 2023 collection on the screen. She's based in London, and she's a hair braiding expert. She's worked extensively in the fashion industry, and this is her brand new collection, her first time in fashion, and it's based on African hair braiding techniques that uses the synthetic hair that is often sold to Afro-Caribbean women for wigs and falls, and various other hair pieces that are worn and are popular. And she doesn't seem to feel the need to separate her work from fashion in terms of line or cut. This is fashionable clothing. It just happens to be embellished with this synthetic hair that she has dyed and applied. So for its part, the fashion industry keeps rediscovering all of the handmade work from the 1960s and 1970s, and so there is still this hunger for the handmade that exists, and it's a way for smaller businesses to differentiate themselves from the mass market, and also a way for people who are really worried at this point about the horrors that the fashion industry has visited on the climate, to try and not contribute more to that, and also to make a positive difference. So you get tie-dye, for instance, Joseph Altuzarra, who is a mainstream high fashion designer, and you get upcycled Levi's with vintage fashions by La Réunion, which is based in Brooklyn, and the ad for the jeans encourages buyers to add their own patches. So this idea of almost crowdsourcing, if you like, or handmade by yourself or someone you know, has circled back again. Roxanda, who is an artist and architect and commercial fashion designer originally from Serbia, now based in London, there's a lot going on in London right now, was channeling that early artwork aesthetic in her 2020 collection, and you see this very chunky patchwork knitted coat, and her smoother, more 80s style patchwork knitted silk caftan, but again, a very non-Western form that was popular in the 70s. And finally, an example that really encapsulates for me what the pandemic has wrought and also what social media has wrought. And that is the J.W. Anderson sweater. This is, you can barely see the sweater in this. It took me a while to find it online in his spring 2020 runway show. It's look number 15, and mostly what you see is that scarf around the wearer's neck. And the black pants. The sweater is just kind of sliding off his body. But later in 2020, this guy, Harry Styles, for any of you who follow celebrity media, happened to be wearing it. He bought one. The sweater retailed for just under $2,000, so not cheap. Definitely not mass market. So he was wearing this when he was rehearsing for a television performance. Somebody took a picture of him and posted it on social media, and social media exploded, as social media is wont to do. And so fans immediately decided to try and copy the sweater themselves. And one of them, a TikTok influencer named Liv Huffman, decided that she was going to chronicle her making of her Harry Styles J.W. Anderson knockoff sweater. Now, she didn't know how to crochet or knit. So she went to Michael's, the craft shop, and bought a bunch of pre-made granny squares and kind of figured out how to sew them together. And here she is, and she posted all of this on TikTok, and here she is in her TikTok buttoning up her finished sweater. And so fans immediately decided that they had to do this too. So Anderson actually put the pattern out on his website for free. Said, you want to make it? Have a good time. And then the V&A reached out and said, hey, this is viral. Would you donate to Jonathan Anderson? Would you donate the sweater that Harry Styles wore? And he did. And then he reached out to Liv Huffman and said, hey, how about donating yours too? And I'll give you one from my collection. So she got her actual real Anderson sweater after all, and now his sweater, which is in front, and her sweater live side by side in the Victoria and Albert Museum, happily ever after. So I think you can see that while it's no longer in the form that it was in the 60s and 70s and 80s, artwear will continue in one form or another. And I think it will do so because the handmade is still and always a precious commodity in our increasingly digitized and computerized world. And I, for one, am looking forward to seeing where it goes next. Thank you.
That was amazing. Thank you so much, Melissa. Really fascinating conversation. We do have some time for questions, if there's anybody who would like to ask Melissa something about the presentation or something about fashion. Anybody? Well, to prime the pump, so I have a question for you. You noted that, especially early on, 60s, 70s, the art world looked down on fashion and artwear. Have things gotten better?
Yes and no. There are museums, bigger museums than the Museum of Arts and Design, that have been collecting artware. I was one of the early ones at the Fine Arts Museums, and I did it in part because there was so much of it in the community here. How could I not? It's in my backyard. But the Philadelphia Museum of Art, just before the pandemic, literally, in fact, the pandemic cut this show short, which was tragic because it was gorgeous, mounted a major retrospective that was based around Julie Dale's collection from Julie Artisans Gallery. And Julie promised like 40 pieces to the museum. So there is now a major repository here on the West Coast, and there are also important pieces in the Oakland Museum as well, and a major repository on the East Coast, which is terrific. So museums, I think, belatedly recognize, and it's easier when it's not contemporary, when you can look back on it as a movement and say, oh yeah, that was actually really significant. It's collecting very contemporary as a museum, wearing my curator hat, I'll tell you, is hard, because you don't know, you're in the middle of it. You don't know what's going to stand the test of time, and museums tend to be very conservative places. You don't want to be the person to stick your neck out and have the curator who comes after you or the one who comes after them say, what the heck was she thinking? So people like to sort of stand back and wait a little bit. But what has happened is that museums have finally caved to the popularity of fashion exhibitions. And I think we've seen that over and over and over again in the museums in the Bay Area recently, particularly the de Young, which kind of, amazes me because they were very resistant during the 16 years I worked there. But now they seem to have a fashion exhibition, every other year, or sometimes every year, or sometimes 2 in 1 year. So that wall has fallen. But it's hard. There are museums that still just shy away from this. And textiles are challenging to preserve. They're environmentally sensitive in the way that sculpture is not and painting is not. So it's a commitment.
Thank you. Yes.
Where do events like the Met Gala fit into this world? Is it fashion? Is it art? Is it just exhibitionism? Or how would you classify it?
Yes, I think the answer to your question is all of the above. A lot of those celebrities work with fashion designers. So it's certainly coming out of the high fashion industry, but a lot of them go way far beyond. People like Billy Porter, who are looking to make the biggest splash possible, are going to go absolutely as far out on a limb as they possibly can. But there are plenty of people who go to that gala who don't make the Vogue's 93 red carpet slides, and who are wearing ordinary fashionable evening dress coming from decent high fashion makers. So it's a pretty wide variety, but definitely the people who are in camera view, the ones that social media is fixated on, the people who essentially live because they are celebrities, are going to be pushing the envelope to the greatest degree possible, but they are rarely completely outside fashion, unless you're Billy Porter, in which case you do pretty much anything you want.
Other questions? I saw other hands.
Well, speaking of museums and the Met Gala and so on, and these big fashion exhibits, which have been going on for 10 or 15 years now, or maybe longer, why do you think it is that people who otherwise aren't particularly interested in fashion are flocking to these exhibits or exhibitions?
Good question. The Met exhibitions, the big Costume Institute shows, have actually been going on since the 1970s. But what changed 10 or 15 years ago was that Anna Wintour got involved. And it became much more about celebrity and much more about the party of the year, the first Monday in May gala. And so that's the shift, I think, that you were seeing. I think there's several reasons. I think, again, part of it's the celebrity connection. There are all these celebrities who are going to see these shows. So there must be something worthwhile. I want to go and walk up these same steps just like, whoever it is I'm following on social media did. But I also think that a big part of the reasons that fashion exhibitions in general are popular, even if you're not yourself partaking in high fashion, as let's face it, most of us don't, is that we all dress. We're all sitting here now wearing clothes, and we all have, I think, a very basic and deep understanding of what it might feel like to wear those clothes. You can put yourself in the place of the person wearing that garment more easily, I think, than you can with some other art forms. And so it's one of the reasons that museums were so down on them for so long was it seemed too populist. It's like, it's popular, it can't be any good because people like it. And don't tell the museum I said that. But I also think that, and also it's very close to commerce. But I think it is just because it is so close to everybody's lived experience. You can look at something fabulous on a platform, on a mannequin, and I hear people talk about this all the time in exhibitions. It's like, I want that one. It's like you imagine wearing it. And so it gives you the kind of vicarious thrill, the same kind of vicarious thrill that people used to get during the Depression, watching all of these movies set in impossibly luxurious situations. They couldn't afford that. They couldn't hope to get to that, but they could pretend. They could imagine themselves. They spark your imagination. And so I think that's the other reason.
Sorry, I'll get over there as fast as I can.
Thank you. I think Project Runway's in its 20th season or something like that. And we watch it in a bunch of knockoff shows like it. And it feels like we've all become fashion critics without really being in the industry or knowing much about it. I just wondered if you had any comments about the media of fashion shows like that.
First, a caveat. I don't actually watch any of the fashion reality shows. I think I saw half of one episode of Project Runway when one of my former students was on it. But, you know, I think actually we've all always been fashion critics. I certainly have been. And, you know, look, come on. You get on the bus, or you get on BART, or you get on Muni, and you're looking around covertly at what people are wearing, and you're thinking, oh my God. Or you're thinking, oh wow, she looks fabulous. Or I really like his shoes. We're all looking at each other all the time and mentally assessing the clothes that we see. And that's part of how we learn about fashion. I mean, if you see somebody wearing something fabulous on BART, you're gonna, you know, go home or, you know, pull out your phone and try and figure out, you know, where they got it, so that you can go buy it too. We're copycat creatures. We like to follow what we think looks cool on other people. So I think, to some extent, it's the same kind of thrill, the sort of the contemporary reality shows that are based in fashion. It's the same kind of thrill that any of the reality shows give people. You know, it's like you get to pick your favorite, you get to root for your favorite, you have a little bit of schadenfreude if somebody who you don't like gets, you know, booted off the island. You know, it's human nature.
Other questions?
One of the things that flashed through my mind is the really lively fashions, especially among rock musicians in the 70s. How would you put that in context with the art fashion thing that you're talking about?
It's an interesting question. In the 60s, a lot of the people who were making sort of nascent wearable art were dressing some of those rock musicians. People like Jeannie Rose, who is my neighbor actually, and who made clothes for herself and her friends. She was one of the people who dressed Janis Joplin. She made men's clothes and was dressing the Jefferson Airplane and Big Brother and the Holding Company. So was Linda Gravenites, was making a lot of clothes for the rock and roll musicians here. Kaisik Wong made some stuff for Betty Carter, a jazz musician. And so people who are going to be on stage and performing have an opportunity to, I think, wear something that is a little more out there. And so I think with the early stuff, a lot of them were very attracted to what these individual makers were making. It could be very personal to them. They could have whatever they wanted. And they were also very much playing with the ethnic looks. I have this image in my mind of Jimi Hendrix in London wearing an embroidered fur-trimmed Persian coat with a pair of hip hugger cords and a flowered shirt. And so that kind of flamboyant mixing and matching is very much part of rock star dress at that time. But I think for a lot of the musicians, they weren't necessarily going to wear those more formal coats. They weren't going to wear a piece like Janet Lipkin's African Mask, which is this big enveloping crocheted coat. You're not going to be able to play the guitar very easily when you're wearing something like that. So there's a level of practicality, I think, that the clothes, as they developed into a more artistic direction, kind of diverged from what rock musicians were doing, and they kind of went off, along different paths. But I think in the 60s and early 70s, they were very much aligned.
Other questions?
I have a pretty snarky question. Current streetwear one sees walking around Berkeley or San Francisco seems unartistic to me. Can you make some comment about current fashion?
I could probably make lots of comment. I think all that's really, really fair to say is that I don't really understand what motivates people to dress in the way they're dressing, people of that generation to dress in the way they're dressing, any more than my parents' generation understood our motivations to dress in the way we were dressing. Every generation reinvents it for itself. And they often do it with an eye to causing maximum distress to mom and dad. Because, if you can't get a rise out of them, then what good is it? But, they're following each other. They're following each other on social media. They're buying things. I find it very interesting. I teach 19, 20, 21, and 22-year-olds mostly. They're very ecology-minded, but a lot of them are still buying fast fashion because it's cheap. They're on Instagram and TikTok, and they're looking at what their peers are wearing, and they're copying each other. So it becomes its own sort of self-fulfilling world. But I don't really understand why they look the way they look. I don't understand the persistence of tattoos, which I thought would have died out at least 10 years ago, and I was wrong, big time. The persistence of piercing, all of those things that are very much part of contemporary fashion. The bare midriff, which, showed up again in a big way in the last year or two. It's like, wow, okay. But so, they're dressing to please themselves, and they're dressing to please their peers.
Probably have time for maybe one more question. Anybody have something they just can't wait to ask Melissa? Okay, looks like we've got all the questions. Thank you so much, Melissa.
Thank you all so much for having me. You were a great audience, and this is the very first public lecture, other than teaching, I have given in person since the pandemic. So I can't tell you how exciting it was to be able to do this in person. Thank you all.